Many of you may have heard of DNA. DNA is genetic material, so it's the master blueprint that the factory refers to when it needs to make things. And DNA is locked up in a very safe bank called the nucleus, which is around here. When something needs to be manufactured by your cell, DNA sends out a little message called RNA, which leaves the nucleus and then goes to the heavy machinery, which is called the ribosome, which is located in this compartment called the endoplasmic reticulum. You're not going to get tested on these things, so you don't have to write notes or take notes or anything. But the point is that the cell's like a factory, and there are a lot of little parts to it. There are other parts like the Golgi apparatus, which is kind of like a packaging center. There's the mitochondrion, which is kind of like the power plant of the factory. And there's something called the lysosome, which is like the waste disposal unit. So cells, which are these basic units of our body, they've approximated about 30 trillion cells that make up a person. They're like mini factories, and they make stuff. So what are these factories making? They make you. And then what are you made out of? Unlike contrary belief, most people are not made out of hot air. Most people are actually made out of water. And 62% of people are actually just water. And that's actually why the kidneys are so important, because the kidneys are the primary filtration system for your body. The rest of you is composed of proteins. 16% of you is protein, and 16% of you is fat. And then there's 6% of other things like sugars and minerals and such. But besides the water, which our body doesn't make water, our body just takes water in and moves it around and then excretes it. The protein and the fat are the main things that we're made out of. So let's focus on the protein production. And so there is a core principle in biology called the central dogma of biology. And this is the idea that DNA, which was stored in the nucleus, can send out this little message called RNA. And then this RNA can then be read by your cellular machinery to make proteins. And this DNA to RNA to protein idea is what is called the central dogma. It's called the central dogma because this DNA to RNA to protein idea does not only apply to people, but it applies to all living things on Earth. Dogs do it, cats do it, fish do it, and even plants do it. And so that's why it's such a fundamental idea that we as living creatures on Earth all share the same central principle of DNA to RNA to protein. And most importantly for this talk, microorganisms use this concept as well. And here we have some bacteria, and here we have some viruses. And bacteria can use DNA to make proteins, and viruses can use DNA as well as RNA to make proteins as well. So now that we have a very solid foundation of biology and we're talking about viruses, let's talk about immunity. Here I have a picture of the entrance of your body, which houses those trillions of microfactories of cells. And here is my rendition of my Mr. T cell and my B cell, which represent the main guardians of your body. And they're kind of like the front gate guards. And let's imagine this scenario where a virus appears at the doorstep. Because this is the first time the virus has appeared or our body has been exposed to this virus, Mr. T cell and B cell don't really see much about it or see this virus as a threat. So the virus then makes its way and pretty much walks to the door and then enters your body without much of a hassle. And then it gets you sick and it infects your cells, and your cells get infected, and your B cells and T cells now have to go clean up that mess. The really beautiful thing about your immune system is that your B cells and T cells have an ability to learn, so that the next time that virus comes along, your B cells and T cells are able to see the proteins on the surface of that virus and recognize that this virus or this pathogen is a bad guy. And so even though the virus may be able to come in for a little bit and infect a small number of cells, the immune response is much more rapid, and B cells and T cells can quickly clear the virus so you won't get as sick. So the immune system, immunity works by learning about different pathogens and recognizing them. And so that virus will be neutralized. And this concept of teaching the immune system is the fundamental idea behind vaccines. So here is a picture of the first vaccine ever given in 1796 by Dr. Edward Jenner in England. During that time, the smallpox virus was causing a huge epidemic where about 60% of the population was infected and about 20% of the people died from smallpox. So scientists at that time observed that milkmaids who were frequently infected by a close relative of smallpox called cowpox, because milkmaids harvest milk from cows, and they would hold the udders of the cows and be exposed to cowpox, which is a relative of smallpox. They would develop these sores on their hands called cowpox sores, but they never would die from smallpox. So Dr. Jenner then postulated that the cowpox and the smallpox were so similar that exposing people to cowpox would allow for immunity against smallpox. So basically, the cowpox teaches your immune system that, hey, things like cowpox are bad for you. So then he tested this theory by injecting some cowpox samples into his gardener's son, and his gardener's son got a little bit sick, but then recovered because it's cowpox, and cowpox is not normally cause severe disease in people. So then what makes Edward Jenner so famous is that he not only injected the cowpox into this child, he then exposed the child to smallpox and shown that the child would not get sick from smallpox. And so that is how the first vaccine was discovered. Going back to our cartoon, vaccines contain the materials that train our immune system in recognizing that a specific virus or pathogen is bad. Thus, we teach the immune system to recognize these pathogens before any infection occurs, therefore preparing our immune system for any upcoming infections. And so let me exit this really quickly so I can share these things. So this is a series of cartoons that I had pulled from the Johnson & Johnson website, which are really great, actually. And it really goes into a great model of how these vaccines work. Johnson & Johnson, unfortunately I have to do it in non-presenter mode, but Johnson & Johnson uses what's called a virus-based vector to deliver genetic material to your cells, whereas Moderna and Pfizer just directly inject RNA into your cells. So we can see that these are the harmless Johnson & Johnson viruses that present the genetic material. And you can see that they're launching this genetic code, and these are called viral vectors. And now that the genetic materials inside of your, these are muscle cells, your cells as the factories can then make SARS-CoV-2 proteins. You can see them getting made, and they're what we call antigens, which your immune system can then recognize, but these are SARS-CoV-2 specific proteins. So that's the first part about what the vaccines do. Like I said, Moderna and Pfizer directly just give the genetic material. Then, now that your cells have started to express the SARS-CoV-2 protein, and I want to really emphasize that it's just one protein, and it's not the virus, the entire virus. It's just one segment of the virus. It's kind of like, I like to describe it as expressing like an arm or a leg of the virus, but it's never the fully functional virus. Then your T cells and the antibodies from the B cells come and recognize that SARS-CoV-2 protein and start learning about it. And this is how the recognition and the training part works for the vaccine. And so now that you've been vaccinated, your immune system has been primed and knows to recognize SARS-CoV-2 protein. So now they're prepared, and in case the virus actually comes and infects your body, or you've been exposed to the virus and the virus makes its way into your system, now you have these antibodies and these T cells that are able to recognize it very quickly. And so the virus will come and try to infect and make its own proteins, and then all of a sudden you have these antibodies that will quickly bind and neutralize the virus. And then you have all these T cells which come and look for your own infected cells and kind of shut off that factory. And that's the beauty of vaccines and how your immune system works. It's really teaching your immune system to be prepared for an oncoming infection. Great. And so, how does this relate to the COVID-19 pandemic? These are the stats that I found last night online. Currently, there are over 115 million cases of COVID-19 globally. We've had about 2.5 million deaths, and the US alone has around 518 deaths. And I want to pause for a second and let you know that I've personally watched many people suffer and die from COVID-19, including my two of my coworkers that passed away last year. I think COVID-19 is a terrible and unforgiving disease. I've witnessed entire families get destroyed by COVID. Besides the immediate infection and the symptoms of the immediate infection, I'm also very concerned about the long-term complications about COVID. Many people report months of cognitive impairment and chronic muscle aches, and we're just beginning to find out what it can do to people in the long run. Who knows what it does to like people who are pregnant or developing fetuses. It's just a terrible disease, and that's why the United States is extremely fortunate to have 3 vaccines available now. There's the Pfizer vaccine, which is the RNA-based vaccine, which requires 2 shots, because the first shot is the first time your body will be exposed. They do a second shot to just reteach your immune system to boost it in a sense, and we call that a booster shot. There's Moderna, which is very similar. It's an RNA-based vaccine, and it is also 2 shots. And there's the Janssen or Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is the virus, the harmless virus vector, which also shows the SARS-CoV-2 protein, and that only requires 1 shot. And as many of you know, these vaccines have all demonstrated amazing protection against SARS-CoV-2. I wanted to share one piece of raw data from Pfizer to show you how well it works. Here we see the this is time, and this is the number of occurrences of COVID-19 over a period of about 120 days. And this is the clinical trials data. Here we see that in red, these are the people who received placebo, meaning that they did not get vaccinated, they received some salt water. And we see that with time, these people who received placebo have a very steady rise in the number of cases of COVID in this group of people. In contrast, the people who received the vaccine saw some rise for the first week to 2 weeks, but by about the time that the second shot was given for Pfizer, the rise, there is no rise in incidence, and people were not getting sick anymore. So this really drives home the point that the Pfizer vaccine, or vaccines in general, are very protective against people who would have gotten no vaccine. And this is the release from the Johnson & Johnson about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. This is 85% overall effectiveness in preventing severe disease. And this also demonstrated complete protection against COVID-19 related hospitalization and death. So vaccine not only prevented mild infections, it also prevented severe, most importantly, prevented severe infections, hospitalizations, and death. And that's very important to know, that you should, having a vaccine will save you from any terrible complications of COVID-19. And this is a picture drawn in the 1700s when the news started spreading about Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine. And if you look very carefully, you see that all of these people here are sprouting little cows coming from their body parts. And of course, no one in the 1700s, after receiving the Jenner vaccine, ever grew a cow out of their body, but the public was very scared. And it's amazing how history has repeated itself, and then the public is still very scared about getting vaccinated. So I think I want to be very clear that the COVID-19 vaccine does not contain any live SARS-CoV-2 virus, and you cannot get COVID-19 from the vaccine. And to emphasize how safe it is, and I've heard this from my own family, that, hey, but people died in that clinical trial. And yeah, people do die. And that's just the product of when you enroll 40,000 people, people unfortunately will die from natural causes. And so if we look at the, specifically the Pfizer FDA report, we see that of the total people who died, six people died in that clinical trial. 2 of them were in the vaccine group and 4 of them were in the placebo group. And they say that all deaths represent, all deaths in this trial were of the similar rate of the general population. And so that's just natural incidence of death. And the non-fatal serious adverse events included some appendicitis and heart attacks and strokes. And those were not anywhere above the high regular basal level of the general population as well. So we didn't see any serious adverse events directly caused by the vaccines. And then these reports were just about the regular general population. When you look at 40,000 people over a period of time, people will develop these events as well as die, unfortunately. And that's pretty much my talk in a nutshell. And so I really wanted to emphasize that I hope everyone's really taken appreciation for basic biology and how we're all connected in this world with all these other living things. And now everyone understands the very basics behind how vaccines work. And I hope that you feel comfortable accepting the vaccine when it's available to you. And that's pretty much it. Do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Liu. That was fantastic. We do have some questions that we will get to. I want to encourage anyone that is out there to submit a question to Dr. Liu in the Q&A in your toolbar. So just click on Q&A and you can submit your question. You can even submit it anonymously if you would like. All right, so the first one is, are antibodies always floating around in my system for every virus that I have overcome, or what sets the production off?
That's an excellent question. And so yes, many antibodies are just floating baseline in your system. And so a lot of times if you start a new job or something in the medical profession, we get regularly checked for antibodies, for example, tetanus or hepatitis B and such, and then they can detect, oh, I've been vaccinated for hepatitis B, for example, and then those antibody levels are what we look for.
That's great. Another question, does Mount Sinai have any data on patients with kidney disease who have received the vaccine? This person said, concerns about relapsing, especially within our disease area, is, rare glomerular disease. And nephrotic syndrome is basically the relapsing type of symptoms that most of our patient population gets. So we're curious if there is any data on collecting data on people who have gotten the vaccine who are kidney patients.
I know that there's kidney research being done with COVID-19 at our facility, but I'm not aware of any vaccine-related kidney research.
Do you know, kind of along with that, is Mount Sinai, are they keeping, or do you know of any registry like in your area? Are they keeping a registry of patients who maybe have gotten COVID and recovered, or just to be able to look at longitudinally how different people with comorbidities are reacting and that sort of thing?
Yeah, Mount Sinai is actually part of a national study called the Paris study, where a lot of people, even me, I've enrolled in it as well, where they collect samples on us regularly to see what our antibody responses are. And they track when we get vaccines, and they track when we get sick, and they know our medical history. So there is a large database that you can, if you want to be a part of, you can look it up. It's called the Paris study. And I encourage people to, I always encourage research. I think that that's the best way to learn about things. So if you'd like to look into that, it's available. There are multiple different longitudinal studies going out there right now.
That's good to know. That's really good to know. Another question, I have COVID-19 is what this patient says. Should I wait to get the vaccine because I likely still have antibodies? Or perhaps if they have COVID-19, perhaps they are making some of those antibodies. What is your suggestion to people who currently have a positive test within that 14-day time frame? Would you encourage them to get the vaccine now, or do they need to wait?
So I believe it depends state to state. And then New York State recently suggested that if you have COVID, that you should wait 90 days because you've likely have a good stimulus or exposure for your immune system to recognize the features of the virus. Mm-hmm. But it really varies, and you have to look into your state regulations. And but I think that you should have significant antibodies. I really want to emphasize that checking if you have antibodies may not be very helpful to you, because the vaccines all express or the spike protein of the virus, which is that red thing that you see on everyone's picture, that external spike protein. So the vaccines train your immune system to make antibodies against the spike protein. However, many commercial antibody tests don't test for the spike protein. They test for different proteins in the virus. So even if you get vaccinated and you're thinking, oh, I have a lot of antibodies against COVID, and then you get an antibody result test back and it's negative, it may conflict with what your thoughts are. It's because what they're testing is not what you've been vaccinated against. So I really caution people for antibody testing, and I don't think that it is necessary, because if you've been vaccinated, you can rest assured that you have antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. You don't have to confirm it by any means. It'll just create more havoc.
That's a really great point, because I think there is some confusion around those antibody tests. So that was a great explanation. Thank you. There's a couple of questions that have come through around medications that our kidney disease population commonly takes. And our population commonly takes immunosuppressants to regulate and to decrease the protein in their urine, right? So the first question, this person is asking that they take many medications for their kidney disease. Does the vaccine counteract my meds? Likewise, there's another question down the line around rituximab, which is a CD20 B cell depleting medication that is also commonly used. And there's a lot of questions around the use of, immunosuppressants and getting the COVID vaccine, and how does that interact, if you want to start off there.
So I would say that the vaccines should not interact with your kidney medications. However, the kidney medications may inhibit the vaccine effectiveness. So because you're taking immunosuppressants, your immune system may not learn as well from the vaccine, and you may not, and certain immunosuppressants such as rituximab are very strong immunosuppressants, and you may not develop the antibody response that the general population will develop. And so you have to be extremely cautious that even though you got vaccinated, you may not be protected to the same degree as the general population.
To the same degree. That's important to note. I know that there's a group that has a longitudinal study called the Tango study, and it is around solid organ transplantation. And they have been collecting data on kidney transplant patients and how they have responded. And some of their preliminary data that's been shared indicates that even transplant patients who have been exposed and have had a positive COVID-19 test, their immune system, because if you think about it, transplant patients are on some of the heaviest immunosuppressants that people get, and that what their initial data has revealed is that they are mounting a response. Is it the same as a non-transplant or a person not on immunosuppressants? No, but they are mounting some response. So to your point of not to the same degree as perhaps you and I who have not had a transplant, that's true. But there is some evidence out there to show that these people can mount some immune response.
Yeah, we have definitely taken care of a significant number of transplant patients and kidney transplant patients at Mount Sinai, and then we do see that the transplant population can get reinfection too. They're at higher risk for reinfection because, or it's either reinfection by a new exposure or that they haven't really cleared the initial infection, and then that flares up again. And so it is definitely on our radar, and we are looking into different types of potential long-term treatments for that as well. And then one of the clinical trials that we run here at Mount Sinai is called hyperimmune globulin, which is kind of like a concentrated infusion of antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. And then we're looking into seeing whether that can be given as a prophylaxis or as like a persistent, like every 3 months you can have an injection and that could protect you for that period of time for these severely immunocompromised patients.
That's great to know. So maybe if anyone here is in the New York area, you can probably, is this on clinicaltrials.gov?
That study is not opened yet, but
it's not open yet. It will be. Yeah.
So that's kind of studies are getting open all over. Yeah. So
that's great to know.
Post-exposure prophylaxis and prophylaxis studies.
So one follow-up question around rituximab, since we covered kind of those immunosuppressants and not maybe mounting the same degree of response as a normal immune system, do you still recommend people to get the vaccine? How would you answer that question?
I think the vaccine is only contraindicated for people with severe allergies at the moment. Okay. So if you have a history of severe allergic responses to vaccines, which some people have really terrible reactions for any vaccine, those people should really think twice about or discuss with their doctor about whether they should receive the vaccine. However, immunocompromised people I would encourage getting the vaccine because something it would be better than nothing. Yeah.
That's right. And I have to also add in here, as far as our kidney community, you have to look at that risk benefit ratio, because if you do get infected by the SARS-CoV-2 virus and end up contracting and having the COVID-19 disease, there's a good chance that they would relapse and have nephrotic syndrome and those types of problems. Whereas if you, whereas if they got the vaccine, even if you are immunocompromised, you might still be able to mount a little bit of a response. So you have to look at those risk-benefit ratio. I always suggest people, and of course, being a doctor, as a nurse, I always encourage people to talk to their doctor if you have further questions. But there's definitely something to be said about protecting the kidney function that you do have right now. So turning the corner a little bit, let's talk about pediatrics. There's one question in here about when their teenager would be eligible to take a vaccine. And do you know if there's one that is better than another based on what you know about the vaccines that are out there right now?
The guidance for eligibility for vaccines really depends state to state. And is one better than the other for kids? This research is actively being investigated, so I don't know.
Yeah, there's definitely I think all three companies who have the emergency use authorization, I think they are all three actively or submitting proposals to begin pediatric trials. I think in most states, Pfizer is open to 16 years in age and older, but definitely check your state. Otherwise, I know that for a while, Moderna was also actively looking for teenagers for their trial to study efficacy. So, make sure that you can look on clinicaltrials.gov. You can just search in COVID and you should be able to see some of these trials pop up. More and more will come up, especially for the pediatric ranges as the data is revealed. So that's good to also mention. If I've already had COVID-19, will the COVID vaccine act more as a booster?
That's my impression of what should happen. Yeah, I think so. It's kind of like getting the second shot, but it's your first vaccine, because your immune system has seen it once, and now it's kind of like redoing the lesson again, in a sense. And then there's probably going to be follow-up lessons in the future as boosters, and it just trains your immune system. Your immune system gets sharper every time it gets exposed to an antigen or some vaccine. Yep. Stronger
and stronger immune system, for sure. Yeah. Amy is asking, what are the potential long-term side effects of the vaccine?
We don't know what the potential long-term side effects of the vaccine are. However, there's very low likelihood that there are many. I would say that the main concern is that that you may develop antibodies that may, there's always a concern that you can develop antibodies that may help the virus and make the virus infection worse, which has not been seen at all. In terms of, I remember recruiting for the virus, for the Pfizer vaccine early on, and people were worried that I'm gonna grow a tumor out of my arm where the injection site. That's very unlikely. I would say that RNA is a very rapidly degraded material. Your body has a wealth of what are called RNases, or enzymes that love to degrade RNA. So that material is unlikely to stay in your system for any long period of time. And the viruses, the adenovirus-based vector from Johnson & Johnson is also likely to be rapidly degraded in your system. And so long-term, it's very unlikely. And I would also remind people that when SARS-CoV-2 infects your body, it essentially spits its genetic material into your cells and makes more viruses. And so the risk side effect of the vaccine is much less than getting the actual infection.
That's great. Next question, Elizabeth has asked, she says, hello. She says, I have an autoimmune disease and was wondering if there's any data on how the vaccine affects T cells that are normally involved in setting off a relapse of the autoimmune disease.
That's a very good question. I'm not familiar with the T cell response due to the vaccines, but I'm aware that there is a T cell response. I don't know if the T cell response should trigger off or exacerbate the autoimmune disease. I'm not sure.
Okay. Jasna, she says, if we test for COVID-19 antibodies, does that mean we're testing for all coronavirus antibodies in our system?
No. Well, that's a very challenging question. It sounds like an easy, it sounds like it's an easy question, but my understanding of the antibody test, first of all, it really depends on which antibody test you're looking at.
Okay.
There's different tests. Some tests for antibodies that may be developed against a protein of SARS-CoV-2 called the nucleocapsid. Other antibodies check for the spike protein. The nucleocapsid protein may be shared amongst, it may not vary as much amongst different types of coronaviruses. So you may have some cross reactivity, but I think that's very low likelihood. And the spike protein tests are usually more specific for SARS-CoV-2 specifically, not MERS or not the other coronaviruses. But I think that most of the antibody tests have been kind of vetted in a sense that they should be very specific for SARS-CoV-2 and should not have much cross reactivity to the other coronaviruses.
Okay.
But you have to look at each individual antibody test.
Sure, sure. Cynthia says, I have minimal change disease. My immune system is suppressed by rituximab. Can my system still produce antibodies to COVID as a result of being vaccinated because I don't have many B cells? So it kind of goes back to that rituximab question.
Yeah, well, and that goes back to the answer. Your immune system should be able to mount an immune response, but it's likely going to be muted in a sense or diminished. But that does not, that should not hinder you from or discourage you from getting the vaccine, but it's likely you may not have as high as a protective effect as the general population.
That's great. William is asking, what is the estimated time frame that the vaccine will work? Will there be a yearly booster? And do COVID patients that have recovered have severe kidney disease?
That's a lot of questions. So
I know, that's a lot of questions. Yeah.
Question one, what is the estimated time frame that the vaccine will work? So some studies have looked at the immune response after infection, not vaccination, but after infection, and then some people have antibodies 3 to 6 months later, and our data is very limited because this COVID-19, and so only been around since 2019. So it's very hard to say how long it will last for. Will we need a yearly booster? Possibly. I don't know. I think immune systems, the antibody levels will kind of rise and then hang out at a high level and then kind of teeter off, but then always kind of like lay in a low level. If you need a booster to kind of wake the immune system up, it's possible. It really depends on whether the pandemic is still around and whether it's still a very prevalent thing in the future. And there's a whole cost-benefit ratio about that. Do COVID-19 patients that have recovered have severe kidney issues? Some do. Some definitely do. Some people have developed, have gone on dialysis and had severe renal failure from COVID-19. And I'm not aware of how well they recover, but some people definitely develop very bad kidney issues due to the infection.
Yeah, we have at NephCure, anecdotally, we have met quite a few people. They have found us because after their COVID disease, they were diagnosed. We have met some who have been diagnosed with minimal change disease, FSGS. Those are the two most common that we hear. Now, we don't know. I mean, there's so many unknown questions, but their disease was triggered or began after their COVID-19 disease. So it is interesting. I think that it goes back to your point earlier that there are so many unknowns in the long-term effects of the COVID-19 disease that we just don't know yet. And that obviously physician scientists like yourself are continually learning and researching on. So that's definitely something we'll continue to watch for. Tina is going back to the pediatric side. She's asking about any trials and research done on vaccine in children.
Yes, yeah, Pfizer and Moderna have been opening up to children, and I'm aware of that. I'm an adult practitioner, so we don't do any peds studies, but yeah. I'm aware that those are getting open, so you can look for them.
Yeah, Tina, I would just suggest to you to go to clinicaltrials.gov, and it's a very complicated website, I'm going to tell you, as far as like just the lay person. But when you go there, you can search specifically for like COVID-19. Even you can put COVID-19 vaccine, and you can look in there. And if there is a Pfizer or Moderna trial open for pediatrics in your area, it will be there. And there will be like a contact, like an email that you would be able to email, or a phone number you can call. I do know that the other day, just on Monday, I heard the Johnson & Johnson CEO said that they would be submitting a proposal to start a pediatric trial for their vaccine for 12 years and older, but that takes some time, to get approved and to really roll it out. So that should be out there, hopefully in the next several months too. So there are some, you have to get on there and kind of look around. Another question, are they safe for transplant patients? I'm 2 months post-transplant and I'm very leery of it.
I can't think of a reason why it would be dangerous. But I think that with any transplant, I think it's always important to have discussions, very open discussions with your transplant doctors. And because every transplant has a unique situation, and your transplant doctor should really know your case very thoroughly. So I would discuss with your doctor.
Yes, I completely agree with that statement. I think anecdotally, the nephrology, the transplant nephrologists that NephCure works with, they are encouraging it. But again, this is a case-by-case basis, and you really need to have that discussion with your transplant nephrologist. So that's good. Another one, I've been hearing conflicting opinions about getting the vaccine while I'm on an immunosuppressant. I haven't had a chance to talk to my nephrologist yet to get his thoughts on it.
Like I said, I really can't think of much of a negative impact from getting the vaccine. The vaccine is just kind of an innocuous, like a harmless protein that's going to get expressed in your body, and then kind of tips off your immune system. There haven't been much negative things about the vaccines. It's safe. So again, have a discussion with your personal doctor.
Absolutely. I will tell the audience here today that NephCure has specific resources directed to our kidney patients and caregivers. So again, in the chat, I put a website. So if you go to nephcure.org, there's a small banner at the top of your screen, and it's a click, and you can click it. It will go directly to our COVID-19 resources. So NephCure has assembled a COVID-19 medical advisory committee. We have doctors from coast to coast. In fact, one of Dr. Sean Liu's colleagues, Kurt Campbell, is on the committee. We have pediatric nephrologists, we have adult nephrologists on it, literally across our country. And they have helped vet the resources that we have made. So please check those out. Some of your questions around, should I get it? Is it safe? You know, I'm on rituximab. I'm on, a lot of questions that we have answered to the best of our ability. However, I have to say, it cannot replace the advice of your own doctor. And so definitely check out our resources. We have a long FAQ document that really goes over very specific questions. In fact, there is one on rituximab in which we have linked an article that actually shows even people who are on those CD20 B cell depleting medications like rituximab, they do mount a response, and there is a safe way to be able to get the vaccine without compromising the integrity of your immune system, the response that your immune system has against your disease. So check those out. Back to the questions. Another anonymous one. Do you have thoughts on the virus variants? I know this pandemic is unprecedented, but do you have any hunch about whether doctors will recommend the COVID vaccine every year based on the variants that you know about?
That's a very hard question because it requires you to predict whether the variants will overcome the vaccine responses. I think that, and the rise of virus variants or essentially what variants are kind of like mutations in the spike protein that your antibodies will not be able to recognize, that have mutated so much that your antibodies can't recognize the spike protein that you've been vaccinated with. It really depends on a mixture of things, how much of a mutation occurs, as well as the prevalence over the period of time of the virus that continues. I wish I had a crystal ball. It's very hard to say. There's two ways it can happen. There could be no problem. We could be done by December or such, or it's going to be an ongoing thing as a yearly thing. And both outcomes, it doesn't change my current management, unfortunately. Yeah.
Sure. And I think too, if you think about the flu epidemic and, influenza, every year it's encouraged that people get a flu shot, and it saves lives every year, the people who get a flu shot. But every year, the physician scientists, they look at which is the variant that's most prevalent, in the community. And then they tweak it just a little bit. So, perhaps that's what will happen with COVID as well, because there are variants, but I think it's time will tell, right? It's going to be data driven. And we know that a lot of research is going on. So, do you recommend one vaccine over another with your research?
With my research, the answer we give for this question is always that the best one is the one that's available.
Yes. I love that answer. Elizabetta asked, is the vaccine likely to cause an increase in proteinuria or relapse in my illness? Now, before you answer, I'm going to say that we do answer this question directly in our NephCure COVID FAQs. So Elizabetta, go to nephcure.org and click on that COVID-19 resource section and download those FAQs. There's not any data to show that that a vaccine will cause a relapse. The vaccines that are out there right now, there is not an indication that it will cause a relapse. However, just like Dr. Liu was mentioning early, whenever when he was talking about severe adverse effects or events within the trials, some people had adverse events, appendicitis, unfortunately a death. But that's not to say the vaccine caused any of that. Sometimes these things naturally occur, especially when you're looking at these diseases that our community has. Unfortunately, you could have a relapse sometimes at any time. So just keep that in mind. But I don't know if you have any other words of advice, Dr. Liu.
My question to Elizabetta is, and to you, Kristen, is that I would assume that people with FSGS regularly get the flu vaccine, and that's recommended.
Yes.
So I wouldn't imagine that the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine is any different than any other vaccine and how it works. It really just wakes your immune system up and makes it aware of something. So I would treat it as any other vaccine.
Yeah, I'm going to go on to this question. The vaccines, because we're running out, we have just a couple minutes left. The vaccines were approved quickly. Does this mean they were rushed?
No, they were approved quickly because the funding was there. Usually the extended duration of time it takes for a vaccine to reach where it has been for these COVID vaccines is really a monetary rate limiting factor. But in this case, our taxpayer dollars said, hey, we really need this now, and it's destroying the world. So a lot of funding went into this. And so those holdups of trying to show data and then get more funding to go to the next step, to show more data, to get more funding, and then all that stuff, all the funding time limitation factors have been washed away, but nothing has been compromised for safety or for clinical trial standards in any sense. So I feel very comfortable saying that the vaccines, in terms of quality control, have followed a very classical quality control standards.
I have a question for you. We get a lot of questions at NephCure from people writing in, asking us about the ingredients and the molecules within the vaccine. There's a lot of, I want to say, misinformation out there about where some of these proteins that are used within the within the vaccine are made, specifically around, embryonic type of cells, if you've heard these type of rumors out there. Can you clarify or give us some advice on where we might be able to get some of the information on ingredients? And are there vaccines, the COVID vaccines, do any of them include embryonic cells? Do you know?
I think the ingredients list is on the FDA websites for the FDA emergency authorization, use authorization. They do contain what are the other inactive ingredients. Are they made from embryonic cells? I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether, I think people are referring to HeLa cells or cells that have been passed from some early progenitor cell that has been then passaged several generations throughout time. And I don't know if either the Johnson & Johnson virus is, I would think that they may grow them on primary cells versus past cell lines, or sometimes you can actually create what's called an immortalized cell line by taking a primary cell and then knocking it off of its normal life cycle to live forever, in a sense, and you can use those as kind of like a soil or fertilizer thing to grow other types of viruses and such. I'm really not familiar with the production side of these vaccines, and I think I would encourage you to go check it out.
Especially if the FDA has, so that's great advice, and that the FDA would have all of that information and the ingredient list. So You know, instead of, you know, repeating rumors and going off of something that you might have heard on social media, you definitely want to do some research and go to valid and reliable websites to give you the information around the vaccines and around the COVID-19 disease and the virus that causes it as well. So at that, we are just a couple minutes over time. Dr. Shanlu, I want to thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. This was so timely, so informative. We have some people chatting in that this was really, really great information. So we appreciate your time. Again,
thanks for
everyone, again, everyone, please, if you have more questions for us, I want you to go to NephCure.org. Remember to copy that website that I put in the chat today. You can access the COVID-19 resources directly from that link. You can also email me at khood@nephcure.org, and I would be happy to try to find you the information and the answer that you need if possible. So just let me know. We thank you for being here today. Dr. Shanlu, thanks so much. This was wonderful, and I appreciate all of your help today. I hope everyone everyone have a wonderful day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Get vaccinated, everybody, if you can.
That's great.
Thanks.